Hello and welcome to episode 253 of the Ideal Nutrition Podcast. My name is Aidan Muir and I'm here with my co-host Torwen Eerkens, and we are going to be talking about how much certain nutrients affect iron absorption. And we're doing this for a few reasons. One is I wanted to do something that's a little bit more practical in terms of we've done plenty of like iron deficiency type stuff, and I just want to talk about some specific numbers and changes you could potentially make and or changes that might not matter at all. One of the places I wanted to start is a kind of personal story that is relevant for me as a dietitian. So when I first became a dietitian, I had learnt the fact that calcium's absorption is inhibited by caffeine or coffee consumption. And technically that is true. And I was telling people that for like a year. I remember working with certain people who wanted to increase their calcium intake, and then they say how they have like milk in their coffee. And I remember like sharing this fact with them about how calcium is inhibited by caffeine. And then one day, I don't know how or where I learnt this, but I learnt that the difference is so insignificant. And I started looking at research on this, and we're talking about such a small difference. Like we're talking something along the lines of if you had a cup of coffee with 300 milligrams of calcium, about 6 milligrams is inhibited. And I was like, damn, I've given people a piece of information that's technically true that probably makes their life worse. Like probably, yeah, it's just not a good thing to be doing. And then it made me start asking questions about a bunch like other stuff. Just like if somebody says this improves absorption, the next question is always like, how much by? Is it meaningful? The same thing if this inhibits absorption, how much by? And I think that's a very relevant discussion in the iron space, because with deficiency being so prevalent, if there is advice around doing things to improve absorption or decrease it, I think it's worth knowing how much this matters.
Absolutely. And when we talk about nutrient bioavailability, we mean the portion of that nutrient that's absorbed and used through food it's absorbed through the cells lining the intestine. So iron has been reported as about 25 to 30% absorbed from organ meats, 7 to 9% from vegetables, 4% from grains, and then around the 2% from the dried legumes, which obviously that's a huge array and it does make a big difference. So we're going to be going through what makes a difference in the absorption, and we're going to start with the positives, so enhancers of iron absorption. I'm going to start with vitamin C, or ascorbic acid then, which is the biggest enhancer of especially non-heme iron absorption. Before we run through this, maybe we should do a little bit of a background on the different types of iron. We have previously done an episode, like Aidan mentioned, on iron deficiency, so that's episode 239 if you want to go and have a listen to that one. But in terms of specifically nutrition strategies, heme iron comes from animal sources, so things like red meat, poultry and fish, and it's absorbed more efficiently by your body. Non-heme iron, on the other hand, is found in plant foods like lentils, beans, spinach, fortified cereals, whole grains, that sort of thing. And absorption is much more variable and influenced by what you eat. So if we circle back then again to enhancers of iron absorption, vitamin C, we're mainly specifically looking at absorption of non-heme iron. And the way that it works is it helps converts ferric or Fe3 plus iron to the more absorbable ferrous or Fe2 plus form, which means it's more soluble in the gut. So even adding something like 50 milligrams of vitamin C to a plant-based meal can actually double up to 6 times increase the iron absorption in that meal.
And that would also then apply to certain vegetables as well. Like if you had a decent amount of vegetables, we can talk about like anti-nutrients and stuff later, but you could get, if you had a lot of vegetables, you could get to that 50 milligram kind of range through that as well. So that'd be super relevant too. The next one we'll talk about, and this isn't an absorption one, but it's kind of an additive one in a way, is cooking in cast iron. So this is something that I'd seen a lot of people talk about, but was unsure how much mattered until a few years ago. And it can increase the iron content of food by around 15% on average. With all of these numbers, both of us, we put in a bunch of research into the show notes, and we've kind of combined the research that has specific numbers and our own take. For example, like if one study said like 12%, another said like 17%, like I'll use a number like around 15%. So like the numbers won't line up 100% perfect, but it's kind of using a bit of our own judgment on that as well. But with the cast iron thing, it's around 15% on average, but there are some cases that are noticeably higher than that. For example, if something is cooked in like a tomato-based sauce that's in there, the absorptions have been measured to be like noticeably higher than that as well.
The next one then is sort of in terms of supplements. Sometimes supplementing on an empty stomach can help because it actually reduces the competition of that iron supplement with inhibitors that we're about to talk about in the next section.
On the effectiveness of that, so what I found was it seemed to be about 40% better if it was on an empty stomach, But there were catches that had kind of been mentioned that are pretty clear. For example, it does seem to increase the likelihood of gastrointestinal symptoms. So whether this should be done is a case-by-case basis, because in some cases it would make sense, and in others it's probably worthwhile trying to address that, because often that's one of the biggest reasons that stops people from supplementing.
Cool. Did you have any other positives that you wanted to chat about?
Another interesting one was animal sources alongside plant sources. So having animal sources alongside plant-based iron sources improves absorption by about 1.3%. So specifically, because we know that there's more heme in heme iron, or in, animal-based sources, non-heme iron absorption increases, even though the meat contains heme iron. I don't think I've put it in here, but I was talking to Tyler about this the other day, but like, if you actually, like, we massively simplify down by saying heme iron and non-heme iron, as in like animal contains heme iron. If you actually do like the measurements, like animal products have both heme and non-heme, and there's a varying ratio amongst that as well. Maybe a bit too deep for this podcast, but just thought I'd chuck that in there too.
Cool. Now, there are obviously negatives then as well, or things that actually block iron absorption and decrease the availability in the body. So the first one I'm going to start with is coffee and tea, or polyphenols, which can actually decrease the absorption of iron quite significantly. So there was a study that had a look at iron replete adults, so they have enough iron, having a look at a cup of coffee with a hamburger meal. And it reduced the non-heme absorption by about 39%, and then a cup of tea, it was about 64%. So it does show that tea potentially is a bit more of a potent inhibitor there.
Yeah, absolutely. And that was one of the first things I wanted to look at after the calcium thing, being like, everyone says this inhibits iron, does it actually? And then unfortunately, yes, it does. One very positive thing, though, is keeping coffee and tea around an hour away from meals, either before or after, largely stops this from being an issue. One of the things that had me curious about that was there are a lot of people who will have caffeine in their system for most of the day. And I was curious, like, if it has this big of an impact, is this an issue? Is this a big thing? But it actually seems just separating it by an hour actually seems to be mostly fine, which is kind of odd in a way, because it's like, if it was about the caffeine specifically, that will be peaking in your blood 30 to 60 minutes later. So it's interesting that. But then if you go through like the tannins and other polyphenol kind of angle, it might make more sense too.
I think I also saw that it does have a bit of an effect in terms of specifically caffeine or coffee in terms of the strength. So it does seem to be a bit of a concentration dependent effect as well. So if you're having lots of caffeine and it's stronger caffeine, then it makes sense to be a bit more cautious around that hour, if not a little bit longer.
Now we're going to talk about calcium. So calcium is another one that like a lot of people talk about in relationships, and it's hard to say how much it matters. For me, one of the first times I'd ever seen this like in practice was I saw a 12-year-old boy who was low iron, which is like rare enough for males to start off with, but he was having like 3 liters of milk a day. I was like, this checks out. Like this is the first time I've seen something like that. But this is because calcium and iron compete for absorption, and for context as well, so do zinc and magnesium. Like all 4 of them are competing together. So having too much calcium alongside iron can reduce absorption, and this applies to both heme and non-heme iron. For what it's worth, a lot of what we're talking about today is actually far more relevant for non-heme iron, and that could partly just be because there's more room to move on that in terms of absorption, because the levels of absorption are so low to start off with. But anyway, so in terms of how much this matters, dosages of 300 to 600 milligrams of calcium, which if I was to add context on that, that's around 1 to 2 cups of milk, can often reduce iron absorption by 20 to 50%. So you go back to that boy I was talking about, and it's like, well, if it was like 3 liters of milk, that's a big reduction over the course of the day, each day, consistently.
That's similar to what I had as well. It does appear a little bit that the type of calcium potentially matters too if we're talking about calcium supplements. But again, I think it just makes sense to say let's split those up rather than taking them at the same time.
Absolutely. And this also has ramifications for like how you supplement as well. It's also, if you look at a regular multivitamin, you'll often find that most regular multivitamins are really, really low in calcium, and this is partly why that is the case. There are definitely exceptions to that rule, but that's a factor.
The last one that I've got then are phytates, which they are found in a lot of plant-based foods, whole grains, veggies, beans, all those sorts of things, which makes this a little bit hard. But they bind to non-heme iron and they form insoluble complexes that then further reduce absorption. And they can reduce non-heme absorption by up to 50 to 70%, which is another quite significant reduction.
Yeah, it's pretty massive. And we were on the fence about whether we include that. I think I don't know if you were in the Instagram post that we're making. You went on that? No. We did a collab with like 5 people on an Instagram post on this, and we decided not to put phytates in because I'm like, I don't want to scare people off of eating like fruits and vegetables and like all these good things that are consistently associated with like good health. But on the other angle, it's actually one of the biggest inhibitors of iron absorption as well. But you can also just get around that by having a higher intake of iron. So like people who are plant-based, it's often recommended having like double, triple the amount of iron to reach these needs, because even if absorption was halved, if you had double of it, like it would solve that. And another way around that is that adding vitamin C, once again, can improve the absorption as well.
Which, again, a lot of those foods maybe contain both, so it becomes a bit of a double-edged sword in terms of what you're looking at. And I think focusing on the positives sometimes actually makes a lot more of a difference than saying, I should cut these foods out completely. That sounds good. We'll wrap up there then. So thank you for tuning in to today's episode. And as always, if you are concerned about your iron status, please go chat to your GP and get some blood tests done. This has been episode 253 of the Ideal Nutrition Podcast. And if you liked our episode, please leave a positive review. Thank you.